Tired of his wife and determined to humiliate her in front of her own family, the millionaire brought his mistress to her birthday party. But what happened next changed their lives forever. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Sarah had looked forward to this day with a mix of excitement and hope. Her birthday wasn't just a celebration. It was an opportunity to reconnect with Richard, her husband, with whom she shared years of marriage and memories that now felt distant. She had spent weeks organizing every detail, from the decorations to the menu, ensuring that everything reflected the love and care she still felt for him. Yet deep down, a silent fear lingered in her chest, one that had grown stronger with time. The distance between them was undeniable. Richard no longer looked at her with the tenderness he once did, and the warm embraces they had shared were now replaced by cold greetings and empty words. Still, Sarah chose to ignore the signs. Today will be different, she told herself as she adjusted the blue dress she had carefully picked out for the occasion, a dress Richard had often complimented in the past. She gazed at her reflection with a hopeful smile, unaware that this night would change her life forever. The first guests began to arrive, filling the house with laughter and animated conversations. Sarah's mother, a strong and perceptive woman, watched her daughter with a mix of pride and concern. "You look beautiful, my dear," she said, taking Sarah's hands in hers. But beneath her kind words lay a worry Sarah recognized immediately. "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah replied with a smile that tried to mask the lump in her throat. Richard's absence became increasingly noticeable. Guests began asking questions, and the curious glances directed at Sarah made her feel smaller with each passing minute. Her older brother, Andres, pulled her aside in the kitchen. "What's going on, I say? Why do you always feel the need to defend him?" he asked, his voice firm yet concerned. Sarah shook her head, trying not to break down in front of him. "Tonight isn't the time to talk about this, Andres. Please, let's not ruin the evening," she said, though her words convinced neither her brother nor herself. Finally, the doors of the house opened, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Richard had arrived, but he wasn't alone. Beside him, wearing a tight red dress and a dazzling smile, was Emma, his personal assistant. Richard, exuding his usual air of confidence and arrogance, introduced her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Emma will be joining me tonight. I thought it would be interesting for her to meet the family," he said, oblivious to the shocked stares around him. Some guests exchanged incredulous glances, while Andres clenched his fists, struggling to contain his anger. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to process what was happening. Emma approached her, extending a hand with a smile that dripped with superiority. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Sarah. Richard has told me so much about you," she said in a tone that felt more like an insult than a compliment. Murmurs spread through the room. Sarah's mother, her face tense and lips pressed tightly together, struggled to hide her fury. Andres took a step toward Richard, but Sarah stopped him with a subtle gesture, determined to maintain her composure. Summoning strength she didn't know she had, Sarah responded, "Thank you for coming, Emma. I hope you enjoy the party," though her voice wavered slightly. Richard, seemingly unaware of the impact of his actions, began chatting with the guests, ignoring Sarah entirely. To make matters worse, Richard took every opportunity to make pointed comments. "Emma has an excellent eye for business. It's refreshing to work with someone so young and ambitious," he said loudly, provoking uncomfortable glances from the guests. Some of Sarah's friends looked at her with pity, while others drifted away, unable to handle the awkwardness of the moment. The tension reached its peak when Richard raised his glass for a toast. "I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate another year in Sarah's life. She's always been a wonderful hostess, and though she doesn't share my vision for business, she's always supported my decisions," he said with a smile that barely concealed his sarcasm. His words were a direct blow, and though Sarah tried to stand tall, she felt the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. Quietly excusing herself, she retreated to her bedroom, leaving the commotion of the party behind. Once inside, she closed the door and let the tears flow freely. As she tried to compose herself, her eyes fell on a box of keepsakes she had stored away for years. Opening it with trembling hands, she found a photograph from her wedding to Richard. In the picture, they both smiled with genuine happiness, a painful contrast to the reality she now faced. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. Andres entered without waiting for an invitation. "You don't have to put up with this, Isa," he said, sitting beside her. "It's not fair, and you know it." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "You're right. I can't let him treat me like this anymore," she said, wiping away her tears. Before Andres could respond, something caught Sarah's attention. An envelope sticking out of a drawer in Richard's desk. Curious, she opened it and found bank documents mentioning a loan signed in her name. Anger mixed with clarity. Since when had Richard been using her name for financial purposes without her knowledge? Returning to the party with a new purpose, Sarah watched Richard from a distance, chatting animatedly with Emma as if nothing had happened. This can't go on, she thought. As the guests began to leave, Sarah resolved that this humiliation would be the last. That night didn't just mark the end of her birthday. It was the beginning of an irreversible change in her life. What Richard didn't realize was that he had awakened a woman determined to reclaim her dignity at any cost. From a distance, as Richard laughed with Emma, Sarah thought to herself, "Richard, you made the mistake of underestimating me, but I won't be the one who loses." Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The night of Sarah's birthday didn't just leave a wound. It sparked a flame within her, one that quickly began to grow into something unshakable. As the last guests awkwardly left the house, Richard remained in the living room, laughing freely with Emma. Their carefree chuckles echoed like cruel taunts, mingling with the faint background music. From the kitchen, Sarah listened, a mix of disbelief and fury bubbling inside her. But this time, she didn't let sadness consume her. For the first time, the humiliation she had endured for years morphed into a silent rage, igniting something dormant within her. The next morning, Sarah woke up early. The reflection staring back at her in the mirror still bore traces of the tears shed the night before, but her eyes carried something new, a glimmer of strength she hadn't seen in years. She whispered to herself, barely audibly, a promise she was determined to keep. She would no longer be Richard's target of disdain. It was time to act. Her first move was to revisit Richard's study, the envelope of documents she had found still vivid in her memory. Every drawer she opened seemed to unveil more secrets. She discovered bank statements with suspicious transactions, contracts with ambiguous clauses, and even a loan signed in her name, something she had never authorized. The air in the room grew heavy as she pieced it all together. Richard had not only shattered her emotional trust, but had also manipulated her financial stability to cover his personal debts. Later that day, Sarah sought advice from Jessica, her lifelong friend. Upon hearing what had transpired, Jessica's outrage was palpable. "You can't let him get away with this, Is. This isn't just betrayal, it's abuse. You need to show him that he can't keep trampling over you," Jessica said firmly. Jessica, ever pragmatic, suggested a plan. Rebuild Sarah from the inside out. She took Sarah to an exclusive salon where the transformation began, not just physically but emotionally. With an elegant haircut, makeup that highlighted her inner resilience, and a dress that radiated confidence, Sarah began rediscovering a version of herself she had long forgotten. Yet she knew that while the changes on the outside were empowering, the real battle lay in exposing Richard and reclaiming her dignity. Over the next few days, Sarah spent hours combing through more documents in Richard's study. The deeper she delved, the clearer a dark pattern became. Transfers to offshore accounts linked to shell companies. The gravity of what she uncovered only fueled her resolve. One evening, while sorting through papers at her desk, Sarah received an anonymous email. The sender warned, "Richard is funneling money into illegal accounts. You're right to be suspicious, but be careful. This is bigger than you realize." The message didn't just validate her suspicions, it also awakened a fear she couldn't ignore. The next day, Sarah tried a new approach. At breakfast, she remained composed, engaging in casual conversation. Richard, puzzled by her serenity, assumed she had accepted her place. But when Sarah casually mentioned a recent bank transfer, Richard dropped his spoon, unable to mask his unease. That evening, As Richard whispered on the phone in his office, Sarah stood quietly in the hallway, eavesdropping. She caught key phrases like inflated figures and keep Emma away from certain documents. Silently, she memorized every detail, knowing these clues would be crucial later. As her investigation progressed, Sarah began looking into Emma's past. What she uncovered was alarming. Emma had connections to a group of businessmen under investigation for money laundering. What had seemed like a romantic affair was, in reality, a calculated alliance Richard had built to cover his financial schemes. When Sarah shared her findings with Jessica, her friend was visibly stunned. "This is bigger than we thought, ISA, but you have everything you need to confront him. Just make sure that when you do, there's no way for him to wriggle out of it." One afternoon, as Sarah organized the documents that would become her strongest weapon, she stumbled upon an invitation to Richard's upcoming corporate event. The event was set to showcase a key project, with Richard surrounded by partners and investors. For Sarah, it was the perfect stage to expose him and tear down the facade he had so carefully constructed. With a mix of adrenaline and determination, Sarah whispered to herself as she scanned the documents, "This is only the beginning." For the first time in years, she felt like she had control over her life, and she knew she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Sarah's transformation wasn't just skin deep. The fire now burning inside her was reflected in every step she took, every word she spoke. Richard, consumed by his arrogance, hadn't fully noticed the change. He still assumed his wife had resigned herself to her role as a submissive spouse. But far from accepting her humiliation, Sarah was meticulously crafting a plan to expose him. The invitation to Richard's corporate event, a night he had been promoting for weeks, was the perfect opportunity. She knew he planned to unveil an important project in front of partners and investors, solidifying his position as a successful businessman. But with the evidence she had gathered and the suspicions forming in her mind, Sarah intended to flip the narrative entirely. The day before the event, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was Jessica, her trusted friend, who had been discreetly investigating some names Sarah had mentioned. "ISA, you won't believe what I've found," Jessica said, her voice quick with urgency. "That shell company Richard has been funneling money into? It's not registered as part of his businesses. Someone else is involved, someone who might be working with him." Sarah paused for a moment, processing the revelation. "Do you know who it could be?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I found something else. Emma has a past. Before working with Richard, she was involved in a scandal with another company. Though the case was hushed up," Jessica explained. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place for Sarah. Emma wasn't just an ambitious young woman. She was using Richard as much as he thought he was using her. That night, Sarah pretended to retire early, but she stayed up late combing through documents and intercepted emails. Among them, she found a recent message from Emma to Richard, filled with complaints about the money not coming fast enough and mentioning someone named Mauricio. Though she didn't yet know who Mauricio was, Sarah snapped a photo of the email as further proof. On the morning of the event, Sarah prepared herself meticulously. Dressed in an elegant outfit that radiated confidence and charisma, she knew she would command attention the moment she walked into the room. She wanted Richard to understand that underestimating her had been his biggest mistake. When she arrived at the venue, the grand hall was already filled with business people, partners, and journalists. Richard was the center of attention, smiling smugly as Emma hovered nearby, looking radiant and self-assured. But the energy in the room shifted the moment Sarah walked through the doors. The hum of conversations turned to murmurs, and heads turned to watch her. Richard stiffened at the sight of her. For the first time, Emma seemed uneasy. Sarah wasted no time. She greeted several of Richard's business partners with a warm smile, including some seated at the main table. Her poise and elegance didn't go unnoticed. "It's a pleasure to see you here, Mrs. Sarah," said Charles, one of the most influential partners, offering her a glass of wine. "The company could use more people with your presence and vision." Richard watched from afar, growing increasingly uncomfortable. He attempted to approach Sarah to regain control of the situation, but she deliberately avoided him, leaving him on the sidelines as she confidently engaged with the guests. For the first time, he found himself excluded from his own circle. The tension heightened when Sarah came face to face with Emma. "I didn't expect to see you here," Emma said with a forced smile. "Well, I thought it was important to support my husband on such a crucial evening," Sarah replied calmly. "It's important to show unity. Wouldn't you agree?" Emma hesitated, unable to find a sharp retort. Sarah's unwavering gaze made it clear the battle was just beginning. During Richard's speech, Sarah seized a moment of distraction to discreetly hand Charles a folder containing the evidence she had gathered. Charles glanced through the documents, his expression darkening. "Is this what I think it is?" he whispered. "Yes, and there's more," Sarah replied. "This is only part of it. If you want to protect your reputation and the company, I suggest you investigate thoroughly." Charles nodded, fully grasping the gravity of the situation. The rest of the evening was rife with unspoken tension. Richard, still maintaining his confident demeanor, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. As the partners subtly began to question him, Sarah quietly left the event with a smile, making it clear that she was in control. Later that night, in his study, Richard frantically reviewed his emails and messages. Charles had called him, demanding explanations about certain transactions that didn't add up. Richard knew the walls were closing in, but he couldn't yet fathom that his own wife was orchestrating the entire unraveling. Meanwhile, from her bedroom, Sarah reviewed the anonymous email she had received days earlier. "You haven't seen anything yet, Richard," she murmured as she turned off the light. She knew the coming weeks would be critical, and she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The grand hall was illuminated with the extravagance Richard loved. Crystal chandeliers, lavishly decorated tables, and an atmosphere buzzing with alliances and ambitions. It was the perfect stage for Richard, who relished portraying himself as the successful, admired man everyone believed him to be. But this night would be different. Sarah arrived slightly later than most guests, ensuring all eyes were on her as she entered. She wore a sleek black dress that radiated elegance and power without opulence. Conversations hushed as heads turned to watch her, curiosity flashing in their eyes. Why was Richard's typically quiet wife suddenly commanding the room with such confidence? Richard tensed immediately at the sight of her, a wave of unease washing over him. "What's she doing here?" Emma whispered, leaning close to Richard. "She's probably here to keep up appearances," he replied dismissively, though his eyes remained fixed on Sarah as she greeted guests with calm poise. Sarah was laser-focused. She had spent days meticulously planning her every move. Tonight wasn't just about attending, it was about exposing Richard entirely. Before the event, she had handed key evidence to Charles, one of the company's most senior and respected partners, who had already begun investigating Richard's financial discrepancies. Dinner unfolded with a palpable tension that many couldn't ignore. Sarah maintained a composed demeanor, but her words were sharp and deliberate, leaving subtle implications in every conversation. At one point, she approached Emma. "Emma, I didn't realize you played such a significant role in the company," Sarah said with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Emma tried to respond with confidence, but her discomfort was clear. "Richard trusts my work. I'm here to help him achieve his goals." "That's admirable," Sarah replied with an edge to her voice. "I just hope everything you do is as transparent as it seems." Emma faltered, her unease growing as she quickly excused herself to find Richard. The evening's climax came when Charles stood to address the room. His voice was steady, commanding attention as he spoke about the importance of integrity and transparency in business. Richard initially smiled, believing the speech to be a mere formality, but his expression shifted as documents were projected onto the screen behind Charles. "Unfortunately, we've uncovered certain irregularities in the company's finances," Charles announced, his tone firm. "These transactions involve unregistered accounts and funds funneled into shell companies." Richard's mask of confidence cracked as he stood. "There must be some mistake. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for this," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. At that moment, Sarah rose from her seat. "Perhaps Richard would like to explain why these transactions are linked to his personal signature," she said, holding up another document she had saved as evidence. The murmurs in the room swelled as every eye turned toward Richard. Unable to bear the mounting pressure, Emma stood abruptly. "This isn't all my fault," she blurted out, breaking the silence. "Richard asked me to help cover this up. I was just following orders." Her confession sent shockwaves through the room. Guests whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to snap pictures or record videos of the unfolding drama. Richard, now visibly furious, attempted to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding. You have no idea what you're talking about." But Charles refused to let the conversation veer off course. "We've decided to convene an emergency meeting with the partners to review these findings in detail. This cannot go unaddressed," he declared with authority. Sarah watched from a corner of the room, her expression calm and composed. For the first time in years, she felt in control of her life. Meanwhile, Emma stormed out of the event, knowing her position alongside Richard was no longer tenable. As the hall began to empty, Richard approached Sarah, his face a mixture of stress and anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed through clenched teeth. "Ensuring that you face the consequences of your actions," she replied coolly, unwavering. "This isn't over, Sarah. You'll regret crossing me," he warned, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. "Maybe," she said, locking eyes with him. "Or maybe this is just the beginning of my new life." As Richard stormed off, Sarah remained standing in the now empty hall, the tension of the evening gradually lifting. She knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready. Her phone buzzed as she left the venue. It was a message from Charles. "There's more than we expected. We need to talk tomorrow." Sarah smiled to herself. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she was fully prepared to face it. The consequences of the scandal began to unfold just hours after the event. Richard, whose public image had always been pristine, now faced a storm of criticism and skepticism. The company's most influential partners demanded an immediate meeting to discuss the evidence presented by Sarah and Charles. Richard tried to buy time, denying everything and claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the documents spoke louder than his words. Meanwhile, far from being intimidated, Sarah grew stronger with each step she took. The night of the event had marked a point of no return. After years of humiliation, she could now see clearly. Richard was trapped in a web of his own making. Determined to stand her ground, she attended the partners' meeting at the main office, not as a mere observer, but as a critical player in the investigation. Led by Charles, the partners began questioning Richard directly. The dubious transactions, offshore accounts, and fraudulent contracts Emma had helped conceal were at the center of the discussion. Richard, increasingly cornered, attempted to blame his team. "I wasn't aware of these transactions," Richard insisted, struggling to maintain composure. "My subordinates must have made these decisions without consulting me." Charles cut him off coldly. "We have documents bearing your signature, Richard. You can't deflect responsibility. If you have something to say, now is the time." Seated at the far end of the table, Sarah listened attentively. She remained silent, but her steady gaze spoke volumes. Richard avoided meeting her eyes, fully aware that she was the architect of his downfall. The final blow, however, didn't come from Charles or Sarah. Eduardo, one of the oldest and most respected partners, stood up with an envelope in hand. "This came into my possession a few weeks ago," Eduardo said, holding up a set of documents that complemented the evidence already presented. "I wasn't sure what to do with it, but now I see I made the right choice by keeping it. Richard, these are records of an account you opened years ago to divert funds for personal projects. What do you have to say about this?" The room fell into a heavy silence. For the first time in years, Richard had no answer. He lunged to grab the documents from Eduardo, but the older man quickly stepped back. "This is a personal attack," Richard finally said, his voice trembling. "You're all trying to destroy me because I've always been the leader. I won't let this continue." Sarah stood up, her words deliberate and sharp. "Richard, this isn't a personal attack. It's simply the truth coming to light. You've spent years living in a bubble of lies, thinking you could manipulate everyone around you. But that was your illusion, not reality. Now, it's time for you to face the consequences." The partners stepped out to deliberate privately, leaving Richard alone in the room for a moment. Sarah remained at the back, watching him with a mix of pity and resolve. Unable to withstand her gaze, Richard approached her in a last-ditch effort. "Sarah, please, don't do this," he pleaded in a low voice. "I know I made mistakes, but we can still fix this. Give me another chance. You and I both know we were strong together." She looked him directly in the eye, her expression unwavering. "Richard, this is the first time I've ever heard you admit you were wrong, but I can't ignore everything you've done. You broke me emotionally, humiliated me in front of everyone, and destroyed everything we built together. I'm not here to seek revenge. I'm here for justice, and that's exactly what I'm achieving now." Before Richard could respond, Charles returned to the room with the other partners. With a firm voice, Charles announced their decision. Richard would be immediately removed from his position, and the company would pursue legal action against him for financial misconduct. Richard tried to protest, but the decision was final. Sarah left the meeting with the satisfaction of knowing she had closed an important chapter in her life. Yet she didn't allow herself to celebrate just yet. Life had taught her to expect surprises, and now she needed to focus on building a future for herself, free from Richard's shadow. That evening, as she returned home, she found an envelope on her table. Inside was a letter signed by Emma. In it, Emma confessed that Richard had manipulated her and that she had fallen into his game out of ambition. However, she also warned that Richard might be planning something desperate to regain control. Sarah took the letter and stored it in a safe place. She knew Richard wouldn't give up easily, but this time, she was prepared for anything. Standing by her living room window, Sarah took a deep breath. For the first time in years, she felt free. The echoes of the decisions made at the partners' meeting lingered for days. Richard had lost everything: his position in the company, the respect of his colleagues, and the trust of those who once admired him. Now, he faced not only a legal investigation threatening to ruin him, but also the absolute emptiness of a life built on lies. For Sarah, however, this moment marked a rebirth, an opportunity to rebuild and embrace the strength she had hidden for years. Days after Richard's removal, Charles visited Sarah with an unexpected proposal. The company needed a new face, someone with integrity and vision, capable of restoring credibility and solid values to an institution tarnished by scandal. Sarah, who had demonstrated her poise and ability during the crisis, had become the natural choice. With evident admiration, Charles offered her a key role on the executive board. "You're the right person to lead this transformation, Sarah," Charles said. "Not just because of your intelligence, but because you've shown that you can maintain composure and dignity even in the worst moments. This company needs a new direction, and you are our best option to guide it." Surprise mixed with a sense of pride Sarah hadn't felt in a long time. She had gone from being invisible, even to herself, to becoming a pivotal figure in rebuilding something meaningful. Yet, she knew that accepting this role would mean a total commitment. Her gaze hardened with determination. "Charles, I accept, but on one condition. I want this company to reflect solid values, a place where people, not egos, come first. If I'm going to do this, it will be on my terms. There will be no room for the mistakes of the past." Charles smiled, pleased. "That's the kind of leadership we need, Sarah. This is your moment." As Sarah took her first steps into this new chapter, Richard, drowning in his defeat, made one last desperate attempt. From the small apartment where he had taken refuge, he tried to reach out to former allies, seeking to reclaim some of his former glory. But every call went unanswered, every door remained closed. Those who once supported him now refused to risk their own standing for a man whose fall had been so catastrophic. Richard was utterly alone, forced to confront the consequences of his choices. One day, in a final act of desperation, Richard appeared at Sarah's doorstep. With a gaunt face and slumped shoulders, he begged to speak with her. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but decided to listen. There was something about him that no longer evoked pain or anger in her, just a distant pity. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Richard began, his voice trembling, "but I want you to know I never imagined things would come to this. I made mistakes, yes, but I always wanted the best for us. Maybe I didn't know how to show it." Sarah regarded him with a calm that disarmed him. The vulnerable, fearful woman he had once underestimated no longer existed. Her voice, steady but firm, broke the silence. "Richard, nothing you did was ever for you. Everything was for you. for your ego and your ambition. I don't hate you, but I don't have compassion for you either. What happened is the result of your own decisions, and I'm no longer a part of it. This chapter is closed." Without another word, Richard lowered his head and left. As he walked away, he realized he had lost not only his power, but also the one person who had ever genuinely supported him. With the past finally behind her, Sarah began building something that filled her with pride. A program to empower women who, like her, had faced humiliation and devaluation. With the support of Jessica and other allies she had gained during her transformation, the project grew quickly, gaining recognition throughout the community. Months later, at an event organized by the company, Sarah took the stage to give a speech. Dressed confidently and surrounded by people who now admired her strength, her words resonated with a mix of emotion and authority. "Our greatest strength doesn't lie in never falling, but in rising every time we do. Today, I stand here to remind you that, no matter how difficult the path may seem, there is always a way to rebuild ourselves, to find a new direction. The past does not define us. What we do with it is what truly matters." The applause was deafening. In that moment, Sarah understood that she was no longer the woman who allowed others to define her worth. She was now a leader, an inspiration, and, most importantly, the author of her own story. Jessica, moved, hugged her after the event. "I always knew you would get here. Look at everything you've achieved." Sarah smiled back. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jessica. But now I understand that this journey was necessary for me to find myself." That night, as she returned home, Sarah sat by the window, gazing at the horizon. She knew challenges lay ahead, but she was ready to face them. For the first time in years, her life was not defined by pain or betrayal, but by her ability to turn wounds into strength. Finally, she had been reborn, not just as a woman, but as a living testament to the fact that, even in the darkest moments, it is possible to find the light. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.